As with all of my reviews for each individual installment of the Saw franchise, I would only recommend watching this review if you have already at least seen the movies preceding it. That kind of goes without saying, but just in case, this video does contain some visual spoilers, not for this film, but for the previous ones, which is the reason why I say you should watch those before seeing this review. But if you have already seen it, then of course we can proceed. Now, I already mentioned in my previous two reviews of Saw 1 and 2 that I personally like the second film the most out of the entire series. More so even than the first one, which tends to be the most popular with most people. And at least for the moment, I would actually have to say that as a general rule, at least for me personally, I like each even number movie in the Saw franchise, whereas the odd numbers I don't enjoy as much, and in particular the ones which I enjoy the most being 2 and 4, and then to a lesser degree number 6. Now, I don't dislike the others, I just enjoy them less, and as I've mentioned before in earlier reviews, and I'll probably mention it again, I personally see the Saw franchise not really as a group of sequels, but actually as one really long movie cut up into parts, almost like a TV series rather than a movie. And I personally really like that. Now, this movie, Saw 3, went into production immediately after the release of Saw 2. It was released in 2006, it had a bigger budget. The second movie had a bigger budget than the first, this one increased it again, but by an even bigger margin. The first movie had a budget of between 1 and 1.2 million, the second movie was 4 million, this movie is 10. Now that's still not a huge budget. Compared to many other movies, that's a tiny budget in fact. But for the Saw franchise, that was a big jump. More than twice the budget of Saw 2. But it paid off, because again, this movie made even more than the previous film at just under $165 million. Which is very impressive. Now, critically, it's actually the opposite. And it's funny how the Saw franchise works in that way. With each new movie, they get more and more financially successful and less critically successful. And one of the main complaints that people who don't like the Saw sequels commonly have is that they become more and more just about the gore and the traps, rather than the suspense and the intrigue, which the first two movies have so well. I can understand that reasoning, as I've mentioned before, although I don't personally agree with it. I consider the gore to be part of the story, not the story as part of the gore. And there is a big difference. And as I mentioned at the outset of this video, this movie will contain some spoilers, but not for this movie. This review primarily contains spoilers for Saw 2, because in Saw 2, for those who have of course already seen it, the movie ends with a very big reveal, and each Saw movie ends with a significant reveal, and of course at the end of Saw 2, we see that Amanda is not who you initially think she is. In the first movie, she's a victim. In the second movie, it seems that she's a victim again, but perhaps a victim who could potentially beat Jigsaw again. But not because she just plays along, but because this time she has a better handle on the situation. But then at the end, it turns out that no, she's actually a villain as well. And that relationship, which you see very briefly at the end of Saw 2, is expounded on more in this one. Now, this movie is one of my least liked of the entire series. Not in terms of quality, I think it is still one of the better ones. But the reason why I don't like it as much is because, at least in my opinion, it's probably the most mean-spirited, at least of the initial Saw films, say 1 to 4. Now that may seem strange to complain about a movie in what's commonly considered a gore porn series as being too mean-spirited. Surely that just doesn't make sense. Well, no, because the other ones, Saw 1, Saw 2, and even some of the others, they don't have a mean-spirited feel. There's a lot of death and pain in it, but that's not what it's about. You can go along with that, you feel for the people, but they just don't have that mean-spirited nature. Whereas, at least for me personally, this movie, for whatever reason, did have more of a mean-spirited feel. And although it certainly didn't ruin the film, it just made me like it less. Now, this particular installment in the Saw franchise is one of the smallest in terms of scope. The first movie was quite small, the second movie upped the stakes with a larger group, and the films after this continue to more or lesser of a degree, involve more people. Especially with Saw 4, there's a lot more characters involved and at play and in various traps. With this film, it's probably the smallest and most personal of all of them, at least in my opinion. It's a much smaller story, it's much more personal to Jigsaw himself and Amanda, and also, probably most notably, a couple of new characters who are going through various Saw-like situations. A young doctor, and also a man who has lost his son. And those two characters play a large role in the film. The majority of the film is about their traps and various choices that they are forced to pass through. And that's not really a spoiler, that's just the very broad overview. And so, overall, without really getting into it any more than that, because, quite frankly, you don't need to, that's all you really need to know about the story, I would say that the best points, again, without spoiling anything, but the best things about this third installment are that you get to see more of the relationship that Saw has with other people, but on a face-to-face level, rather than speaking through his puppet. That was interesting. You get more of an insight into him, his god complex, the kind of person he is on a more face-to-face level, which in the second film you kind of get, but at the same time you don't really, because he's still engineering the situation, kind of like the Joker, where he wants to be caught. In this film, not so much. As far as things that I didn't like as much, well, to be honest, it was only the aspect that I mentioned earlier, the fact that it is a little bit more mean and mean-spirited in general. Now, that doesn't ruin the film, and I know for many other people they probably wouldn't find that an issue at all. It just was for me personally. And I know that sounds like a strange thing to say about a franchise such as Saw, but that's just the case for me. So, what about our individual breakdowns? Well, first of all, we have, of course, the story and the plot. And although the story is much smaller, it manages to tell a very good story with that smaller, more claustrophobic feel. There are less locations, less main characters that you root for and follow, and I think that benefited the film. It was specifically designed, in fact, to have a more emotional story, and I personally believe that they did accomplish that. So overall, I'm going to give the story of Saw 3 a 6 out of 10, which is incidentally the same that I gave to the first film, because there are certain aspects, such as the smaller size, the smaller scope, less characters, and more of an emotional punch, which it shares in common with that first movie. And to be honest, for people who are perhaps less of a Saw fan overall, you may well find yourself liking this film in addition to the first one, because it's less like the rest, and, at least in my opinion, more like that original movie. What though next about the characters, the motivations behind them, the way they're portrayed? Well, overall I'm going to give it a 7, and that's incidentally the same score that I gave to the second film, because although there are less characters to work with in this movie, I personally felt that that was perfect for the story that it was trying to tell. As I said, it had that more personal feel, very deliberately so, and it pulled it off, and that was very heavily based on the characters, the actors, their portrayal of the people involved, and I think they did a good job of it. It wasn't Oscar level, of course, but I would say it was at least as good as the portrayals in the second film, which is why I'm giving it a 7, like that movie. Next up we have the visuals, the special effects, makeup, etc. And for that I'm going to give this movie a 7, which is also incidentally the same score that I gave to the original Saw film. And the reason why is again very similar. This film looks good, it certainly looks better quality than the original, but there are less visual effects at play, at least less grandiose ones, less opportunity to show off those makeup effects, practical effects, etc. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a fact. You do still get some great traps, some great scenes, some great deaths, and for Saw fans, you'll get your fill of that. But they just weren't as memorable, at least for me personally, as in some of the other films, such as Saw 4, for instance, or Saw 6 even. So overall, it's a 7 from me. That brings us next, of course, to the audio, the soundtrack, the music, and I actually mentioned in my last review for Saw 2 that all of the following Saw movies from 2 onward, I would be giving a score for that audio and soundtrack of 6 out of 10. And the reason why I'm giving all of them that same score, at least from number 2 onwards, is very simple, because they all use a very similar soundtrack, a very similar sound design, very similar sound effects, and the quality level and the effectiveness of the music, the sound effects, the design of the audio in general doesn't really fluctuate. It sticks to a set level, and it makes the world feel stitched together, which is how it should be. So overall, it's a 6 from me. And finally, for the rewatchability and entertainment factor, we're going to revisit my giving it the same score as the first movie one last time, for a score of 6 out of 10, which is lower than the second movie. I gave that movie a 9, because, for me at least, that is a far more rewatchable film. It's a lighter tone, you can take it less seriously, it has less of an emotional impact, and it's a bit more of a popcorn movie. Not that you have to have it like that, but that just gives it a little more rewatchability. It's a less heavy feeling movie, and I think audiences in general could possibly rewatch it more often, whereas for a movie like this, because there is that extra emotional punch, you kind of have to focus on it more, you feel more for the characters, and some aspects of this film, to be honest, feel more unjust than the previous ones, and to be honest, than the ones after it as well. Of all of the Saw franchise, I may actually rate this film the worst in that regard. There is some injustice in there that just doesn't feel right. As right as any of these films can feel, of course. It's all very relative in that regard. And as far as what I mean by that, well, some who watch the film may understand, others may not. It's a personal thing, of course, and that is very subjective. The whole point of the rewatchability and entertainment is to be subjective. So overall, I'm giving it a 6, again, like the first film, and overall I do think this shares many similarities with that original movie. And that means that overall I'm giving Saw 3 a pretty decent score, and also incidentally a slightly higher one than the first movie of 3.2 out of 5, compared to 3 out of 5 for the first movie and a much higher 3.9 for the second one. Overall, this movie is kind of mixed for me. Many people think of the Saw movies as being kind of blended together, very much of a muchness. Do they really change that much? Well, yeah, they do. If you really single them out, they're all very different to each other. And this one is one of my lesser liked. I don't dislike it, I liked what they did with it, I saw what they were going for, and I think they did accomplish that. It's just that what they were going for simply wasn't as enjoyable for me personally. But overall, a 3.2 out of 5 certainly isn't bad, considering it's one of my less liked of the franchise. So that's it overall for this particular pick, and of course, if you've seen the previous 2 films and haven't checked this one out, of course I would recommend doing so. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.